Somewhere under the hills of southeastern Ohio, the story goes, a crew of coal miners broke through a wall that nobody had put on the map. It was 1911. They were working a face in the Hocking Valley. Deep in the country, the old boosters like to call the little cities of black diamonds, and the wall they hit was not rock. It was built, mortared, squared. That is the version you will hear. And the part of the story that does the real work, the part that gets repeated in comment sections and in videos and in the low, confident voice of somebody who read it somewhere, is what came after. The whole shift was transferred by spring. Every man who saw it moved. Different mine, different county, different payroll, as if the company had reached down and quietly emptied the room. It is a good story. It has the shape of a true one. And I want to be honest with you from the first minute, because I think honesty is more interesting than the alternative here. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. I cannot find that mine. I cannot find those men. There is no shift roster, no inspector's filing, no company letter, no newspaper column inch that I can put in front of you and say, there, that is the 1911 wall. What exists is a shape that travels well and reappears in Missouri and in Kentucky and in Pennsylvania and in Wales, with the details filed off and the date moved a few years either way. But I am not going to leave it there, because leaving it there would be the laziest thing anybody could do with this material. The reason that story spreads is not that people are stupid. It is that people are standing on top of something enormous and genuinely hidden, and they can feel it, and nobody ever told them what it was. There really is a buried world under southeastern Ohio. There really are sealed walls down there, thousands of them, built on purpose, and the men who worked behind them really did vanish from the record in ways that look, from a distance, like erasure. There really was a shift that did not come home. There really is a fire that has been burning under those hills since 1884 and is burning right now, tonight, while you are watching this. None of it required a lost civilization. All of it required a ledger. So let us go down there properly. Not the version with the torchlight and the squared stones. The version with the seam thickness, the weigh scale, the deed language, the payroll book, and the price of a ton of coal delivered to Columbus. Because by the time we come back up, I think the ordinary answer is going to sit heavier on you than the strange one ever did. Start with the ground itself, because the ground is the reason anybody was ever there. Southeastern Ohio sits on the western edge of the Appalachian Coal Basin. Perry County, Athens County, Hocking County, spilling into Morgan and Vinton. The rock underneath is Pennsylvanian, laid down in a long series of repeating layers that geologists call cyclothems. Sandstone, shale, clay, limestone, coal, and then the whole sequence again, over and over, like a stack of paper where every so often a black sheet has been slipped in. Those black sheets are the whole story of the region. Most of them are thin and worthless. One of them was not. The seam that mattered was the Middle Kittanning, and in that corner of Ohio it was numbered the No. 6. Locally, and this tells you everything about how people felt about it, they did not call it the No. 6. They called it the Great Vein. In places it ran 11 and 12 feet thick, and in a few spots better than that, which in coal terms is a room with a ceiling. A man could stand up in it. He could swing a pick without kneeling in water in a 2-foot crawl the way his cousins did in the thin seams of West Virginia. The coal was bituminous. It burned hot. It went into locomotives and into foundries and into the boilers of a country that was in the middle of turning itself into an industrial power and could not get enough of it fast enough. That is the first thing to understand about the sealed wall story. It comes attached to a place where the ground actually did contain something like treasure, and where enormous amounts of money and violence and law were spent to decide who got it. If you were looking for a place where a company might do something quietly, you could hardly pick better ground. The instinct is not wrong. The target is wrong. Now the second thing, and this is the one that dissolves the wall. A sealed wall inside a coal mine is not an anomaly. It is a requirement. It is one of the most ordinary objects in the entire underground world, and if you had gone down any working mine in the Hocking Valley in 1911, you would have walked past dozens of them in a shift without turning your head. Here is why. A mine kills you with air. Not with cave-ins, mostly, though those do their share, with air. Coal seams hold methane, which the miners called fire damp, and it seeps out of freshly cut faces the way water seeps out of a cut spring. In the worked-out sections, where the coal is gone, and the timbers rot, and the water stands, the oxygen gets eaten by oxidation and by rot, and what is left is black damp, which will drop a man where he stands without any warning smell at all. And after an explosion or a fire you get after damp, which is mostly carbon monoxide, and which historically killed more miners than the blast itself ever did. The only defense against any of that is moving air. A mine is a machine for moving air. A fan at the surface, usually at an upcast shaft, pulls a current through the whole underground works, and that current has to be steered. It has to be forced to sweep along every working face where men are cutting, then carried out again, and it must not be allowed to take a shortcut. Air, like water and like money, will always find the shortest route unless you build something in its way. So you build stoppings. A stopping is a wall. It is built across an entry or a crosscut that you do not want the air to travel through, and it is built to be tight because a leaking stopping steals the ventilation from the men working beyond it. In 1,911 inches Ohio, stoppings were built of whatever the company thought was worth spending. The cheap ones were slabs and boards, daubed with mud. The better ones were dry stacked rock from the roof falls. The good ones, the permanent ones, in main entries where the air pressure was highest and the consequences of failure were worst, were masonry. Brick, block, mortared stone, laid square by a man who knew how to lay it, sometimes plastered over to seal the last of the leaks. Read that back and hear how it sounds when it comes out of the mouth of a 19-year-old who has never been underground. A mortared, plastered, squared stone wall, standing in the dark, hundreds of feet below the surface, in a place where no wall has any business being. That is your Tartarian chamber. It is a ventilation control. It cost about a day of a bricklayer's wages, and there is more of it than that. Beyond stoppings there were doors, hung in wooden frames, which had to be opened for the coal cars and closed instantly behind them, because a door left open short-circuits the entire ventilation current of the mine and can kill men half a mile away who never knew anything had happened. The company did not usually pay a man to do that. It paid a boy, he was called a trapper, and he sat in a hole cut in the rib beside his door for 10 or 11 hours in complete darkness with a lamp, if he was lucky, listening for the wheels, opening, closing. There are photographs. They are not comfortable to look at. Some of those boys were 8 and 9 years old. Then there were the SEALs proper, and these are the ones that most deserve the word. When a section was worked out, or when a fire started in the gob and could not be put out any other way, the company sealed it. Not partially, completely. Barrier walls across every entry into that district, built thick, sometimes with a pipe and a valve left through them, so the atmosphere behind could be sampled without opening anything. The whole point of the seal is to starve the fire of oxygen and to keep the accumulated gas behind it away from the working sections. Once a district is sealed, the air behind it goes over to methane and carbon dioxide within weeks. Opening it is one of the most dangerous acts in mining, because the moment you let fresh air into a body of methane that has been sitting at explosive strength for years, you have built a bomb and struck the match yourself. And beyond the seals, inside a single company's mine, there were the barrier pillars between companies, which are the strangest and most legible thing down there. Where one operator's workings approached another operator's workings, both were required to leave a wall of unmined coal standing between them. Not a built wall, a left wall, sometimes 50 feet thick, sometimes more. It is the property line, rendered in the commodity itself, and it is the only fence in the world that is made out of the thing being fought over. Now here is where the folklore and the fact touch each other, and where you can see how the story probably got born. Miners really did break through walls they were not supposed to break through, and when they did, it was frequently a catastrophe. The abandoned works of an old mine fill up with water. Nobody drains them once the pumps go off. Behind a barrier pillar, or behind a seal, You can have a standing body of water under real pressure, held back by nothing but coal, and the assumption that everyone's survey was accurate. And surveys were not always accurate. Maps were kept by the company. Some were sloppy. Some were deliberately vague about how far a crew had trespassed sideways into a neighbour's coal, because stealing coal across a property line was a live and profitable practice, and you do not draw a careful map of a theft. So a face crew drills and shoots, and the shot opens a hole into an old flooded room, and the water comes through that hole with the pressure of a fire hose the size of a wagon, and it does not stop. Men drown underground. That has happened many times, in many countries, and the accounts of it are among the worst things in the literature of the industry. Or the hole opens into gas instead of water, and the gas comes rolling out into the working section, and if it reaches an open flame or a spark off a pick or a shot fired a minute later, then the mine kills everyone in that district, and quite often everyone in the district next to it. That is what an unexpected wall meant to a working miner. Not wonder, not a lost civilization. It meant that somebody's map was wrong and you might be about to die because of it, which is exactly why the fire boss existed. Before every shift, in every gassy mine, a certified man walked the faces alone, ahead of everybody, carrying a flame safety lamp. That lamp is a small piece of genius. It is an oil flame enclosed in a cylinder of fine wire gauze, and the gauze conducts heat away fast enough that a flame inside cannot ignite gas outside it. Its real function was never light, it was measurement. In an atmosphere with methane in it, the flame grows a pale blue cap over the yellow, and the height of that cap tells a trained man the percentage in the air with real precision. He would lower the lamp to the floor for the heavy gases and raise it to the roof for the light ones, and then chalk his initials and the date on the rib to say he had been there and it was safe to work. Canaries came later and were used more in rescue than in daily inspection, but the principle was identical. Everything about the underground world was an instrument for reading an atmosphere that would not announce itself. So we have accounted for the wall. It was a stopping, a seal, or a barrier pillar, and it was ordinary, and finding one where you did not expect it was a genuine emergency for reasons that have nothing to do with mystery. What about the second half of the story? The whole shift was transferred by spring. I want to give that one its due, because on the surface it sounds like the tell. Move the witnesses, break up the crew, scatter them across 4 counties, and the thing never happened. The trouble is that in the Hocking Valley in 1911, a whole shift being scattered across 4 counties by spring was not evidence of a cover-up. It was Tuesday. The industry ran on churn. A mine opened, boomed, worked out its best rooms, and the company shifted men to the next opening. Mines closed for the season, because coal demand was seasonal and the operators would simply idle a works for months. Mines closed for a strike, or reopened with different men after one. Men followed the work because the work did not stay. A miner in that valley might work 4 different mines under 3 different companies inside 2 years and think nothing of it, and his name would appear and disappear in company books each time without anyone recording where he went, because nobody was keeping a national employment record of coal miners for the benefit of future historians. And the deeper point, the one worth sitting with, is that the same system that moved a shift in the spring was the system that moved a shift out of existence permanently, and that second thing is documented, and it is worse. Because the population of the Hocking Valley Coal District did not just get transferred, it got deleted. Here is the arithmetic that ought to be the actual hook of this story. At its peak, that string of towns held tens of thousands of people. New Straitsville, Shawnee, Corning, Rendville, Congo, Santoy, Murray City, Buchtel, Gloucester, Moxahala, Hemlock, opera houses, brass bands. 3 newspapers in a town of a few thousand. Rail service several times a day. Immigrant halls where you could hear Welsh and Italian and Polish and Hungarian on the same block. Go there now. Some of those places are villages of a few hundred. Some are a road, a church, and a cemetery. At least one of them is a field with a historical marker where a town of 2,000 used to be, and the field is not a metaphor. Santoy had a mine, and when the mine closed in the 1920s, the town emptied, and then it burned, and the ruins were pushed over, and now there is grass. A whole shift was transferred by spring, yes. And then a whole valley was transferred over about 40 years. and there is a complete paper trail for it, and almost nobody has read it. So let us read it. The Hocking Valley coal boom got moving after the Civil War, when the railroads reached down into those hills. And the thing to understand from the start is that the coal and the railroad were frequently the same money. This is the piece that the mudflood version of history always misses, because it is looking for a hidden actor when the actual actor was standing in the open wearing a good coat. An operator who owns coal land and also owns or controls the road that hauls the coal gets paid twice on the same ton, once at the tipple and once again in freight. It means he can price a competitor out of existence without ever undercutting him at the mine, simply by adjusting what it costs that competitor to move product to Columbus or Toledo or the lake docks. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. It means the rational business move is not to mine better. It is to control the rails, the tipple, the town, the store, and the money the men are paid in. Which they did, and this is where the ledger becomes the real subject of this documentary. Take the wage first, because the wage in a coal town is not what most people think it is. A miner in that period was generally not paid by the hour. He was paid by the ton of clean coal he sent to the surface. That sounds fair. It is not, and the reason it is not is a single word. Screened. The company did not weigh what he loaded. It weighed what passed over a screen at the surface, a set of bars with a fixed spacing, and everything small enough to fall through the bars was slack, and slack did not count toward his pay. The company still sold it. Slack burned perfectly well in a boiler and had a market, so there was a portion of every miner's actual production which the company received and sold and did not pay him for, and the width of the bars on that screen was set by the company. Then the weight itself. The car went over the company scale, and the company's weighman read the scale, and the company's clerk wrote the number in the company's book, and that number became the wage. The miner was underground. He could not watch it. If the number was low, he had no way to prove it and no standing to argue. The fight over this is one of the great forgotten labor struggles in America, and it produced one of the strangest job titles in industrial history, the check weighman. Miners in a given mine would agree to pay, out of their own wages, a man of their own choosing to stand at the scale beside the company weighman and keep a parallel book. Understand what that means. Working men, who were paid poorly, and in a currency the company partly controlled, elected to reduce their own pay in order to purchase the right to watch a number being written down. That is the true and permanent subject of this whole niche. Not chambers, not walls, who holds the ledger, and who is allowed to read the scale. Every good story about a hidden past turns out, when you follow it far enough, to be a story about custody of the record. The check weighman is that idea in its purest available form, standing in the rain at a tipple in Perry County, Ohio, with a pencil. Companies fought check weighmen bitterly. They fired the men who elected them. They refused them access to the scale house. It took decades and state legislation in coalfield after coalfield to establish the plain principle that a man is allowed to see his own output measured. Ohio was earlier than most, and even in Ohio the practice had to be defended over and over. Now, the money he was paid in, scrip, company money, paper or metal tokens issued by the operator, good at the company store and nowhere else, or redeemable in cash later at a discount if you were in a hurry and willing to lose a cut. The company store, which the miners called the pluck me, set its own prices, and those prices were not competitive because there was no competitor within walking distance in a valley where most families did not own a horse. Layer the rest on. The house was company-owned, and the rent came off the pay before he saw it. The tools were bought from the company. The blasting powder was bought from the company, and powder was expensive, and a miner in that era bought the explosive he used to produce the product his employer sold. The doctor was the company doctor, and his fee came off the top. The coal that heated the company house was bought from the company. So run the ledger to its end, and see what it actually is. Wages paid in company currency, spent at a company store, on goods priced by the company, to live in a company house, working with tools and powder purchased from the company, measured on a company scale by a company weighman, recorded in a company book. It is not a wage system with a store attached. It is one closed accounting loop, and the man is inside it. He could still come out ahead in a good year with a thick seam and steady work. That is why people came, and they came from a very long way. But he could also come out of a bad year owing money to the entity that employed him, and if he owed money, leaving was complicated in ways that were social and practical, even where they were not strictly legal. There is one more line in that ledger, and it is the one that stays with me. The mules hauled the cars in the underground hallways. A mine mule was often kept below ground permanently, stabled underground, working in the dark for years. Many went blind, or nearly so. They were bought, fed, doctored, and maintained, and when a mule was killed by a fall of roof, the company recorded a loss because the mule was capital. It had a purchase price and a replacement cost, and it appeared on the books as an asset. The man did not. The man was, in the cold arithmetic of the operation before workers' compensation, an input that replaced itself for free. If he died, another one walked up the road from the depot next week and asked for work, and no line item was created and no capital was destroyed. There are contemporary accounts from more than one coalfield of the observation, made bitterly by miners themselves, that the company took better care of the animals. It was not rhetoric, it was accounting, and it was correct. Hold that thought, because in a moment we are going to watch the state of Ohio put a price on the man for the first time, and the year it happens is 1911. Before that, the violence. In 1884, the Hocking Valley operators cut the tonnage rate. The miners refused it. What followed was not a strike in the way people imagine strikes. It was a lockout that ran for months and turned into something close to a small war. Families were evicted from company houses in the autumn. Militia were brought into the valley, and the operators brought in strikebreakers, many of them black men recruited out of the South, moved north by rail into a situation most of them had not been told the truth about, and set down among desperate white miners who had been out of work for a year. That is the ugly, ordinary machinery of it. Coal companies did not import black labour out of any conviction. They imported it because a divided workforce is a cheap workforce, and because a man who has just been carried 500 miles into a hostile valley cannot easily walk home. And out of that, one of the more remarkable places in Ohio history, Rendville, founded by the operator W. P. Rend, who built an integrated town deliberately in a valley that had just been torn apart along racial lines. Black and white miners living and working in the same small place, and by the standards of the 1880s in America, that was an experiment with genuine risk attached to it. From Rendville came Richard L. Davis, and if this documentary has one man in it you should walk away remembering, it is him. Davis was a black miner who became one of the most effective organizers in the American coalfields, who wrote constantly to the Union press in plain, hard, unsentimental prose, and who was elected to the National Executive Board of the United Mine Workers of America in the 1890s, at a moment when the country was busy building the legal architecture of segregation. His argument was simple and unanswerable. The operator does not care what colour a man is. The operator cares what a man costs. Therefore, a workforce split by race is a workforce that will always be beaten because there will always be somebody hungry enough to take the other side of the line. Solidarity, in Davis's telling, was not a moral luxury, it was arithmetic. He was blacklisted for it. He struggled to get work in the last years of his life. He died young, in Rendville, in 1900, of lung disease, poor. I want to be careful here, because this is the moment where the revisionist frame usually gets deployed badly. Nobody erased Richard L. Davis. His letters survive. Historians have written about him. Rendville has markers. The reason most people have never heard of him is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary way a country decides what it will keep at the front of its memory and what it will file in the back, and that is a slower and more corrosive process than suppression, because there is nobody to accuse. Now, 1884 again, and the fire. Because during that same lockout, in New Straitsville, somebody did something that has never stopped happening. The account, which is local, contested in its details, and has hardened over the decades into something close to civic legend, is that men loaded mine cars with timber, soaked them in oil, set them alight, and pushed them into the great vein. Whether it was exactly that, whether it was one act or several, whether it was strikers or someone else taking advantage of the chaos, the historical record is genuinely muddier than the plaque suggests, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. What is not muddy is the result. The seam caught. An 11-foot bituminous seam running under thousands of acres of hills, connected to itself through the old works, with air finding its way in through 100 cracks and abandoned entries. It caught, and it went, and it never stopped. The New Straitsville mine fire has been burning underground since 1884. It is burning right now. It has outlived the union that fought that lockout, the companies that provoked it, every man who was there, and the entire American coal economy of the 20th century. The effects on the surface over the decades read like something out of a story you would not believe if it were told to you. Wells that ran hot enough to boil. Ground that steamed after rain and stayed clear of snow in winter, in long, strange lines that traced the seam beneath. Smoke seeping out of hillsides. Tree roots cooked in the earth. There are accounts of people frying eggs on the ground as a novelty for visitors, and of hot water being drawn straight from a well. In the 1930s, the federal government tried to stop it. The Works Progress Administration put men on a project to dig a trench, an enormous cut across the path of the fire, and flush it and fill it and starve the seam of fuel. It was serious work at real expense in the middle of the Depression, and it employed a great many men who badly needed employing. It failed. The fire went around, or under, or through a route nobody had mapped, which is what happens when your opponent is a seam whose full geometry was never accurately surveyed in the first place, because the surveys that existed had been made by companies with reasons of their own. Sit with the shape of that, because it is the true version of the thing the sealed wall story is groping toward. There is a sealed, burning world beneath those hills. It was created in a single season by a wage dispute. It has been burning for well over a century. Attempts to close the account have failed. And it is not hidden at all. There are signs. There is a festival. The town leaned into it, because when your industry has left and your population has fallen by 90%, the fire under your feet is the only asset you have that nobody else can copy. A receipt, still smouldering, and now sold as an attraction. Now we come back to 1911, which is the year in the title, and which turns out to be a genuinely significant year in Ohio coal, just not for the reason the story says. The first decade of the 20th century had been appalling for American mining. The disaster years piled up, hundreds dead at a time, and the numbers finally got large enough and public enough that the federal government moved. The United States Bureau of Mines was established in 1910 with a mandate to investigate causes and to reduce the death rate, which up to that point had been treated substantially as weather. And in Ohio in 1911, the state passed its workers' compensation law, which within a couple of years became compulsory. I want to describe carefully what that law did, because it is the hinge of this entire program. Before it, a widow's only route was a lawsuit, and the lawsuit ran into 3 defences that had been carefully built over the previous century, and that together made a mining death almost unrecoverable. Contributory negligence, which meant that if the dead man had contributed in any way to his own death, and underground everybody contributes to everything, the employer owed nothing. Assumption of risk, which meant that he had known the job was dangerous and had taken it anyway, and so had accepted the outcome as part of the bargain. And the fellow servant rule, which meant that if the fault lay with another employee, a shot firer, a driver, a fire boss, the company was not liable for one workman's act against another. Between those 3, the practical answer to a man being killed underground was usually nothing, or a small sum paid without admission, at the operator's discretion, because it looked bad in town not to. Workers' compensation swept that away and replaced it with something that was better and colder at the same time. No fault. You did not have to prove the company was wrong. You did have to accept a schedule. And a schedule is a price list. That is the thing to hold. The reform, which was real, and which miners fought for, and which made life materially better, worked by converting the body into a set of numbers fixed in advance. A hand is worth this many weeks of wages. An eye is worth that many. A leg below the knee is one figure, and above the knee is another. Death produces a payment to dependents with a cap on it, and the cap is a number chosen by a legislature. So take the two halves and put them together. In the 1880s, the mule was on the books, and the man was not. By 1911 and 1912, the man was on the books. He had a value. That was progress, and I mean that seriously. But the value was set by statute, it was capped, and it was now the whole of the employer's exposure. Which is to say, the reform also functioned as an insurance policy for the industry. It converted an unpredictable and occasionally catastrophic legal risk into a fixed, budgeted, per-ton cost of doing business. That is not cynicism. That is what the operators themselves said in the debates, because a known cost is easier to live with than an unknown one, and they were not wrong about it. The year the sealed wall story wants to be about is, in the real record, the year the death of an Ohio miner acquired a defined price. And here is the part of the schedule that shows you exactly what a price list can and cannot see. The schedule handled sudden events, a roof fall, a shot gone wrong, a haulage accident, an explosion, things with a date on them, things where you can point at a shift and say, that is when it happened. It did not handle the dust. Coal workers' pneumoconiosis, black lung, kills slowly and without a date. A man breathes coal and rock dust for 25 years, and his lungs stiffen and scar, and he loses air a little at a time, and at 50 he is walking to the porch in stages, and at 55 he is dead, and no single day did it. There is nothing for a schedule to attach to. So for decades in coalfield after coalfield, the disease was treated as an old man's condition, or as miner's asthma, or as simply what happens, and it had no line. It took until the late 1960s, after the Farmington disaster in West Virginia and an enormous fight involving miners themselves, for federal law in 1969 to establish real dust standards and a federal black lung benefits program, 1969. More than half a century after Ohio priced the sudden death, the slow one finally got its own paperwork. And in a detail that should stop anybody who thinks this is only history, black lung rates in Appalachia have risen again in recent decades, including severe forms in relatively young miners, and a major suspected driver is silica dust, because as the thick easy seams were exhausted, the machines began cutting more and more rock alongside thinner coal, and rock dust is worse for lungs than coal dust is. The seam ran out. The dust got sharper. The disease came back. Now the ground itself, and the most literal hollowing in this whole story. Ohio coal country ran, and still runs, on a legal instrument called the severed estate. The surface of a piece of land and the minerals beneath it are two different properties, and they can be owned by two different parties. In the boom years, land agents moved through those hills, buying mineral rights from farmers who had no way to value what was under them, for sums that looked like a windfall at the time and look like a joke now. And the deed did not merely convey the coal, it typically conveyed the right to take it, which meant the right to undermine, the right to build hallways and airways, the right to divert water, and, crucially, in many of these old instruments, a waiver of liability for damage to the surface caused by removing what was underneath. Now put that next to how a room and pillar mine ends its life. The mine is driven as a grid. Rooms of coal are taken out, and pillars of coal are left standing to hold the roof, and the pillars can be 40% of the seam or more, which is an enormous amount of product left in the ground. So when the district is finished and the company is ready to abandon it, it goes back in and mines the pillars themselves, retreating toward the entrance and pulling the supports out behind it as it goes. They called it robbing the pillars. The roof comes down behind the crew as they retreat. It is meant to. A controlled collapse is safer than an uncontrolled one, and every ton of pillar coal recovered is profit that would otherwise have been abandoned. That collapse does not stay underground. Over years and decades it works upward through the overlying rock as subsidence, and it arrives at the surface as sinking ground, cracked foundations, split walls, doors that will not close, roads that dip, ponds that appear where there was pasture, and wells that go dry because the fractures have dropped the water table into the void. And the deed the farmer's grandfather signed in 1890 for a modest sum said the company was not answerable for it. So the man in the story sees a wall and thinks somebody hid a chamber. The truth is that under a great deal of that country the ground has been deliberately hollowed, deliberately collapsed, and the collapse was paid for in advance by a signature obtained from someone who could not possibly have understood the geometry involved. There is even a second sale on the same hillside, which is my favourite small detail in the whole region. Above the coal in that stratigraphy sits clay and shale, and Nelsonville and the towns around it turned that clay into paving brick, millions and millions of them, hard, vitrified block that went into the streets of cities across the Midwest. You can still drive on Nelsonville brick, so a single hillside was sold once for the black layer and once for the layer above it, and both were shipped out on the same railroad, and what stayed behind was the whole. That is the pattern this niche keeps finding wherever it looks. The material leaves, the value leaves, the receipts leave. What remains is the shape of an absence, and a generation later somebody stands in that absence and correctly senses that something enormous happened here and that nobody explained it to them, and reaches for the only explanation on offer, which is that it was hidden. Which brings us to the shift that really did not come home. The 5th of November, 1930, Mill Field, Athens County, Ohio, Sunday Creek Coal Company, Mine Number 6. An explosion, attributed to accumulated gas ignited underground, tore through the works in the middle of a working day. 82 men were killed. It remains the worst mine disaster in Ohio history. And there is a detail in it that is almost unbearably on the nose for everything we have been talking about. Among the dead were company officials. A party of executives and visitors had gone underground that day on a tour to look at newly installed equipment. The men who owned the ledger and the men who worked the face died in the same air. Nothing about Millfield was hidden. There were inquests, there were newspapers, there are photographs of the crowd at the shaft mouth, of the tipple, of coffins. There is a marker. The families knew that afternoon. So we have, in the actual record of this exact coal field, an event where an entire shift did not come back, where the whole community was reorganized around the loss, and where the disappearance was total and permanent and not metaphorical at all. And it did not need to be sealed behind a wall, because nobody needed to conceal it. It was simply the price of the operation, and the price had been publicly agreed. That is the hardest idea in this program, and I want to state it plainly. The reason there is no conspiracy in the Hocking Valley is not that nothing terrible happened. It is that everything terrible happened openly, was recorded in ordinary documents by ordinary clerks, was legal and was profitable. Concealment was unnecessary. Tedium did the work that secrecy is imagined to do. A thing filed in a state mine inspector's annual report, in small type, in a table, in a volume nobody has opened since, is more effectively hidden than anything you could brick up underground, and it costs nothing to hide it there. Now let me tell you what the valley did with what it had left, because this is not only a story of subtraction. The United Mine Workers of America was founded in Columbus, Ohio, in 1890, and the organizing that fed into it ran through these hills. There is a place outside New Straitsville called Robinson's Cave, a rock shelter in the woods, where miners are said to have met in secret to organize when meeting openly would have cost them their jobs and their houses. Whether every meeting attributed to it happened there hardly matters. The fact that a coal field needed a cave to hold a conversation in tells you the shape of the power arrangement more efficiently than 100 pages of analysis. And when the mines went, the valley did what emptied places do. New Straitsville became, among other things, a moonshine district of some renown during Prohibition, a second economy running in the space the first one vacated, with the hills and the old works providing exactly the kind of terrain that discourages inspection. Then the water turned orange. This is the part that most visitors notice first and understand least. Across southeastern Ohio, in the Monday Creek and Sunday Creek watersheds and elsewhere, streams run a rusted, unnatural orange, and the rocks in the bed are coated with it. That is acid mine drainage. Water enters the abandoned workings, contacts iron sulfide minerals exposed by mining, and comes out acidic and loaded with dissolved iron. When it hits the open air and the pH shifts, the iron precipitates out as that ochre sludge, and it smothers the stream bed and takes the aquatic life with it. Streams in that region ran effectively dead for decades. The mine closed in 1920 and kept discharging in 1990. That is the actual afterlife of the industry. The company dissolved, the payroll ended, the town emptied, and the chemistry stayed on shift. There has been real restoration work since, doser systems and treatment wetlands and steel slag beds and a great deal of stubborn local effort, and some of those streams have come back to life, and fish have returned to water that was orange within living memory. It is genuinely good news, and it is worth saying out loud in a program like this, because the temptation in this genre is to make everything a descent. But notice who is paying for it. Not the operators. They are gone, most of them dissolved into other corporations, or simply out of existence long before anybody thought to send a bill. The clean-up is public money and volunteer weekends and university programs. The extraction was private, and the remediation is collective, and that is not a scandal that anyone hid. It is just how the ledger was drawn, and the second half of it came due 70 years after the first half was spent. Meanwhile, the land itself was quietly bought back. Large parts of that ruined, cut-over, undermined country became the Wayne National Forest, assembled largely in the 20th century out of ground that was worn out and cheap. Forest grew back over the old works. It is beautiful now, in the way that a place can be beautiful specifically because everyone left, and now the region sells that. There are heritage trails. There are the little cities of black diamonds, a name that has been carefully kept alive by people who love that country, with tours and archives and markers. There is the old Moonville Tunnel out in Vinton County, a railroad tunnel in the middle of the woods with no road to it, which draws ghost hunters year-round on the strength of stories about a lantern and a man on the tracks. I do not say that to sneer. Those stories are how a place that lost its economy keeps a claim on the attention of the world. But look at the sequence and tell me it does not rhyme with everything else here. The valley sold its coal, then it sold its clay. Then the coal ran out, and it sold its emptiness. And now, in the last stage, it sells the mystery of its own emptiness back to an audience that arrived a century too late to see what actually happened. The ground has been mined 3 times, and the third seam is the story, which is where the sealed wall of 1,911 lives, incidentally. In that third seam, it is not a memory, it is a product. Now I want to say something about why the buried version is so much more attractive than the documented one, because I do not think it is a defect in the people who believe it. We are surface creatures. Everything in our instincts is organized around light and air and horizon. Being underground is the single most reliable way to make a human being uneasy, and mines make it worse than caves do, because a cave was made by water and a mine was made by people. A mine is a corridor built by haus, running through solid rock, in the dark, in a place where nothing lives, and where the air will kill you without telling you. So when a person hears about a wall down there, the discomfort they feel is real and correct and appropriate. The discomfort is not the error. The error is in what the mind reaches for to explain it. It reaches for an agent. Somebody built this. Somebody hid this. Somebody moved the witnesser. And the true answer is worse in a way that is much harder to hold in your head, because the true answer has no author. There was no meeting. Nobody decided that the Hocking Valley would be emptied. It was emptied by 10,000 rational decisions made in offices by people optimizing perfectly ordinary things, each of which was legal, most of which were disclosed, and none of which required anyone to lie. A villain is comforting. A price mechanism is not. That is why the wall story keeps regrowing no matter how many times somebody explains a stopping. The explanation removes the villain, and without the villain the unease has nowhere to sit. And the unease is not going anywhere, because the unease is a correct response to a landscape that really was hollowed out and abandoned by people who profited and left. There is one more practical thing worth knowing, and it is the closest anyone will ever get to opening that wall. Ohio keeps an archive of abandoned underground mine maps, thousands of them, surrendered by operators over the decades, and they have been scanned and made searchable, and you can sit at a kitchen table and look at the actual room and pillar grid drawn under a town where people are asleep tonight. Some of those maps are precise, some are guesses. Some end in blank paper where a company simply stopped drawing, and the blank paper is the honest record of a firm that no longer cared what happened after the last car went up. If you want to see the hidden geometry beneath the hills, it has been public for years in a state database with a search box and nobody standing guard on it. So here is the verdict, stated as plainly as I can state it. There is no chamber under Perry County, There is no lost race, no pre-flood city, no squared masonry from a civilization the textbooks forgot. The walls are real, and there are thousands of them, and every one of them is an engineering control built by a wage earner to steer air, or to starve a fire, or to mark a property line in the only material available. The vanished shift is real too, in the aggregate, and it vanished into gas, into water, into worked-out coal, into a company book that stopped listing a name because the man had gone to the next opening over, and eventually into Columbus and Akron and Detroit and the automobile plants, because the valley stopped being able to feed its own children, and the one genuinely uncanny thing in the entire district, the fire that will not go out and has not gone out in more than 140 years, was not left by anybody ancient. It was left by a wage cut in 1884, and it is still burning because nobody has ever been able to afford to close the account. That is the whole of it. Sealed walls that were ventilation, a transferred shift that was churn, a hollow underground that was pillar robbing, a hidden record that was a table in a state report, and a real buried world, which is the town, not the temple. Now, the part where you can check any of this yourself, because a story that cannot be checked is just a mood. Find the nearest old coal field to wherever you are. And it does not have to be Ohio, because this pattern was exported everywhere the seams ran. Then ask 4 questions, in this order. First, what came out of that ground, how much of it, and in what years? Production figures were reported. They exist. Somebody counted every ton, because somebody was being paid on every ton. Second, who owned the coal, and who owned the surface, and whether those were the same party. In the courthouse there are deeds, and in those deeds there is language about mining rights and about subsidence and about liability, and that language will be 130 years old and still operative. Read it. It is dull, and it is the most honest document in this entire program. Third, what happened to the people? Look up the census for those towns, decade by decade, and watch the numbers rise and then fall, and note the exact 10 years when the fall begins, and then go and find out what closed in that decade and who closed it. Fourth, and this is the one almost nobody asks, when the ground sank, or the well went dry, or the creek turned orange, who paid? Find out whether anyone was ever compensated for the surface that dropped, and who is funding the treatment of the water now, and compare that to who took the profit when the coal was moving. You will not find a vault. You will not find masonry from a forgotten empire, and you will not find a suppressed inspector's report about a chamber under the Great Vein. You will find a receipt. It will be legible, it will be legal, it will be signed by someone's great-grandfather for a sum that seemed generous at the time, and it will still be doing exactly what it was written to do. And when you are standing on a road in Perry County that dips slightly in a place where no water ever ran, over a district that was robbed and dropped on purpose 80 years ago, on ground that is warm enough, in one particular spot, that the snow does not sit, above a fire lit by men who were told their pay was being cut, and who decided the seam should burn if they could not work it, holding a deed that says nobody owes you anything for the way your house is leaning, I think you will understand why people believe in the wall. They are standing on top of something enormous, and buried, and deliberate, and it has never once been explained to them by anyone who owed them an explanation. The wall is not the strange part. The wall is masonry and mud, and a day's wages. The strange part is that everything the story imagines was concealed was instead written down, filed, indexed, printed, and left in the open, where it has sat undisturbed for a century because the truth was arranged in columns and nobody reads columns. Go and read the columns, then make of that what you will.